Good morning. Let's go back to 2008, fairly recently. It's a film called Telstar, the Joe Meek Story. Now, Telstar is a biopic or biopic. I don't know how you pronounce that. Biopic? Biopic? Yes, it must be that. It's a biopic about Joe Meek. He's one of the most mythologized people in British pop music. Telstar was also a satellite. Now, Telstar, the satellite, was one of the first commercial satellites. It was one of the first satellites with a commercial purpose. The Soviet Sputnik was the first thing launched into orbit by humans. It radio beeped. That's what it did. But Sputnik 2 carried Laika, the dog. Bell Laboratories' Telstar in 1962 carried telephone and television signals on July the 10th in non-geosynchronous orbit. It gave a 20-minute window every 2.5 hours over the Atlantic and carried the first ever live television satellite transmissions. A live press conference from President Kennedy of America and bits of a baseball game. The transmitters failed in November and then permanently by February 1963. But in that 6 months of operation, Telstar changed everything that we perceived about the world we know. The immediate and 24-hour news cycle was born then, making newsreels obsolete pretty much overnight. Telstar failed prematurely because of Starfish Prime, which was a thermonuclear high-altitude test. Joe Meek, the producer, on the other hand, Joe Meek, he was a producer, a sound engineer and a songwriter. I say songwriter, he wasn't a musician. These days, we might call him a sound designer if he had access to synthesizers, but he was about half a decade too early for subtractive synthesis. When he was young, he developed an interest in electronics and built circuits using borrowed components. For his national service, he was in the RAF as a radar technician. He worked for the Midland Electricity Board and acquired a disc-cutting lathe to make his first record. Much later, Meek set up a studio in a 3-floor flat at 304 Holloway Road, Islington. The first hit from there was Johnny Layton's Johnny Remember Me from 1961, and culminating with the Honeycombs' Have I the Right in 1964. Very often the live reverb from the bathroom was used for vocal treatment, and players would be distributed in various rooms or even staircases, mic'd up with cables everywhere in the flat. The Tornadoes' Telstar 1962, which was an instrumental, became the first record by a British rock group to reach #1 in the US Hot 100. He would write songs despite not playing any instrument or knowing anything about musical notation. He would vocalise or hum into tape, and one of his musicians would transcribe it. Telstar's sound was a clavioline. It's possibly a univox clavioline, a 3-octave keyboard controlling a monophonic valve oscillator, which was nearly a square wave, with vibrato through high-pass and low-pass filtering, then distorted by the inbuilt amplifier. The concept of voltage control was not invented yet, hence the relatively static organ-like sound. The sound manipulation consisted of switch banks, much like organ stops. It was certainly used a lot in science fiction film scores, but it was not until Telstar that it was to be misused as the lead instrument. Meek was obsessed with both Buddy Holly and communicating with the dead, and became somewhat paranoid, although nowhere near as much as the film conveys. He suffered what we now would categorise as signs of depression. He was interested in space-age experimental pop music, well, aren't we all, which was already a thing. For example, Bebe and Louis Baron. Is it Bebe or Beeb? And by then, Rockets for Peace and Science achieved public awareness. He made use of overdubbing as a compositional tool, which is quite important. That's music concrete, in effect, or collage. He was also innovative in designing audio compression and reverberation for a much more overt sound, much hotter sound than the sedate classical studio use up until then. Prince actually was guilty of that as well. He drove everything way hotter than any normal sound engineer would recommend doing. He would, Joe Meek would build what are now known as DI boxes for direct injection of the signal of an electric instrument into the mixing desk, bypassing any amplification and miking. And this would influence contemporaries such as George Martin, who would go on to produce the Beatles. After his death in 1967, Joe Meek's death, thousands of unreleased recordings hidden in his studio were bought by Cliff Cooper for £300, which was moved out of the building in a tea chest. In the mid-80s, Alan Blackburn, former president of the Joe Meek Appreciation Society, catalogued them. In 2008, they were then auctioned for £200,000. These included recordings of David Bowie singing and playing saxophone, Gene Vincent, Ritchie Blackmore, Jimmy Page, Tom Jones, as well as a lot of Joe Meek's own experimental music. On 2nd of September 2020, Cherry Red Records announced that they had purchased the tapes from Cliff Cooper and would begin the process of digitising the archive with a view to releasing the material, subject to rights clearance. Telstar, The Joe Meek Story, 2008. Have a happy Tuesday and enjoy the rest of the week. Don't forget to like and subscribe, if you do like it, that is. Thank you very much. Bye.